For the love of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, another salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of the ashab of Sayyid al-Shuhada, one more salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Perfect. One of the questions which mankind has dealt with since the beginning of time is a question which is considered to be universal in all aspects of the word. And that question is a question which we ask by virtue of us being human beings. That question is none other than the question of death, the nature of life after this world, and the true reality of the hereafter. You see, every significant school of thought has offered some form of insight or another into this question, whether it was the philosophers of ancient Greece, whether it was the theologians of medieval Europe, whether it was the Stoics of ancient Rome, whether it was the thinkers of the Enlightenment or the intellectuals of the modern world or the various religious traditions of the world. Each of these different groups has offered some form of insight or another as to what is the nature of life beyond this world. For example, an individual like Socrates, he would say that death is the separation of the body from the soul. And the job of the soul is to think and understand. Therefore, if there is a person who desires to know the truth, then it is only natural that such a person will desire death, because death is that bridge to understanding the truth. You find another individual said no. Another Greek philosopher by the name of Epicurus, he gives a very opposite understanding. He says that because we have not experienced death, we do not have any way to understand it. And if we don't have any way to understand it, then what is the point of discussing this subject? You find he offered another opinion. Another individual, a Roman thinker by the name of Cicero, he said that death is an endpoint. Now, as to what comes after this endpoint, either you believe that there is nothing beyond this world. If you believe that there is nothing beyond this world, the natural result of this is that there is no more pain and suffering. But if you believe that something is beyond this world, then at the end of the day, you are going towards your destination. Thus, death is something which is desirable, either from the perspective that it ends your suffering, or it's taking you towards a destination which you desire. You find that this was another opinion. Another individual by the name of Spinoza, who was a 17th century Dutch philosopher, Spinoza, he said that thinking about death is not profound, but rather to think about death is something which is minimal in comparison to thinking about life. You see, each of these different groups and each of these different understandings offer a very different perspective about death. That's why some individuals, when they sought to understand death, they looked at it from the historic perspective. In other words, they examined that what are the different historical views about death. Another group of individuals understood it from the psychological perspective, that what impact does death and knowing that death is real have upon the human psyche and the human understanding. No, another group approached it from a perspective of sociology, that how do human societies deal with death, and how do they find how they connect with those members who have died. But without a doubt, when you look at all of these different perspectives and all of these different approaches to death, the most profound approach has been offered by the various religious traditions of the world, and particularly in the religion of Islam and in the school of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. As in, it is only in the school of Ahlul Bayt that you find an individual like Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. Only here do you find a man speak about death at such a profound level that he says, Wallahi labnu Abi Talibin anasu bil maut min at-tifli min tadyi ummihi. That the son of Abu Talib by God is more acquainted and familiar with death than an infant is with the breast of its mother. That you see, when we look at the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and we see that when he is struck with the sword upon the 19th of Shahr Ramadan, the famous line of the Imam is what? He says, Fuztu wa Rabbil Ka'bah. That by the Lord of this Kaaba, by the Lord of the Kaaba, I have been successful. Only an individual who has lived his life in success is an individual who can say that I am this familiar with death. In other words, these two statements are linked with each other. And you find that when one approaches death through the ayat of the Quran and through the narrations of Ahlul Bayt, then their perspective on death is going to be very different. As in these days, we are remembering Imam al-Hussein and the companions of Imam al-Hussein. Imam al-Hussein, in one of his statements in the land of Karbala, he says that Khattul Maut ala wuldi Adam ma khattul qalada ala jid al-fatat. When he is speaking, he says that death to mankind is like that necklace which is placed upon a young girl. In other words, that you find this is something natural. To give a necklace to a young girl in that way, death is something natural towards the human being. And when you have this outlook on death, which the Imams of Ahlul Bayt have given, then only then can you say, Al-Maut ahla min al-asal, that death is sweeter than honey. You see, in this series, the goal of this series is to understand the nature of a human being and what it means for us to be called insan. And if we are going to understand our nature, then one inevitable reality of our nature is that each and every one of us is going to die. As the verse of the Quran says, Kullu nafsin dha'iqatul maut, that every soul shall taste the taste of death. But why is it that despite knowing this is inevitable, this is something which will come to everyone, the first question of this analysis is that why do we naturally have a fear of death? You see, there are one of two reasons or both that we fear death. The first reason we fear death is because we don't have a proper understanding of death. You know, it's stated in the narrations that there was a companion of Imam Ali al-Hadi salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. This companion of the Imam, he had a physical illness. But when the Imam looks at him, he notices that there is more worry on his face than the signs of that physical illness. In other words, if he wasn't going to die from the illness, he would die from worry. So the Imam says to him that, why are you in such a state of worry? He replies by saying that I am ill and I am going to die. And the fact that death is coming is worrying me. The Imam replies to him by giving him an example. He says, oh man, imagine that there was a pond. And that pond, when you went into it and you cleaned yourself in that pond, all of the wounds from your body are gone. And all of that illness within you is gone. Would you fear going to that pond or would you run towards that pond? The man replies by saying, if there is such a pond, why would anyone fear something like that? The Imam says this is the nature of death for a believer. For a believer, death is that reality which purifies them. So you find after this, that companion of Imam Ali al-Hadi, his perspective on death, it changed in a very different manner. So you find the first reason that we as mankind fear death is that we don't understand it. Either we reject life after death or we have a misconception of life after death. But the second reason that we fear death is because we fear the life that we have lived. You know, the Quran in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, in chapter 62, verses 6 and 7, it says that, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, that, O Prophet, say to the Jews, إِن زَعَمْتُمْ أَنَّكُمْ أَوْلِيَاءُ لِلَّهِ مِن دُونِ النَّاسِ فَتَمَنَّوُا الْمَوْتِ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. That if you think that you are the only chosen people of God, then the sign of being the chosen people of God is that you should fear death. In other words, you are beloved by God, so death should bring you closer. You know, there's a famous narration that one day it is stated that Malik al-Maut is sent to the Prophet Ibrahim. And the Prophet Ibrahim, as you know, had the famous distinction of being called Khalilullah, the friend of Allah. So when Malik al-Maut comes to Ibrahim, Ibrahim says to Malik al-Maut, "O the angel of death, go back to Allah and say to Allah, have you ever seen a friend want to cause his friend to die?" When the angel of death goes back towards Allah, Allah says to the angel of death, "O Malik al-Maut, tell Ibrahim that have you ever seen a friend hesitate to meet his friend?" So you find that those who are the chosen of God, those who are the friends of God, the Quran is saying that you should strive for, you should look forward towards that. فَلْيَتَمَنَّوَا الْمَوْتِ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. But the condition of those Jews, those individuals who made these false claims, فَلَا يَتَمَنَّوْنَهُ أَبَدًا بِمَا قَدَّمَتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ. Listen to the ayat of the Quran. The ayat of the Quran is saying that the reason these individuals, they will never desire death, is because what their hands have sent forth towards Allah. Meaning that because of the life that they lived, a life of hypocrisy, these individuals will never desire death because they know that they will face the results of their actions. So the first reason an individual fears death is because they don't understand death. The second reason an individual fears death is because of their actions. But when there are a group of people that they understand death properly and their life is a life of virtue, then that group of individuals can say that it does not matter whether death comes towards us or we go towards death. As in what is mentioned in the famous statement of Ali Akbar on the way to Karbala. So you find this subject of analysis, of understanding death and the reality of death is something that one can approach from a number of different angles. But one of those angles, which is particularly profound and fascinating, is an angle which is mentioned in the Quran in Surah Al-An'am, the 6th chapter of the Quran, in the 2nd verse of this chapter. And that is that verse which I recited at the beginning of this lecture. Within that verse, Allah, He says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن طِينٍ. That Allah is the one who created you from clay. ثُمَّ قَضَى أَجَلًا. After He created you from clay, He decreed that there would be an end point to your life. وَأَجَلٌ مُّسَمَّى إِنْدَهُ. But there is also another endpoint which has been decreed. And that endpoint is known with God only. And then after that it says, ثُمَّ أَنْتُمْ تَمْتَرُونَ. Yet you remain in a state of doubt. So in tonight's lecture, we'll examine this verse step by step. And through the examination of this verse, we'll come to the conclusion that every human being who exists, God has decreed 2 times of death for them. The first time of death is that final scale, but the other time of death is one which remains in your control, that you can bring it closer to you or you can distance it from you based upon if you live a life of virtue or not. And in this manner, this ayat, it approaches death from the perspective of free will and predestiny. You see, many people, they struggle with this question, that what element of our life is in our control and what element of our life is out of our control. Each of us recognizes there are many things that we can't control. I cannot control what time period I was born in, and I cannot control what family I was born in. And there are many incidents that I tried my best to acquire that job, for example, but I couldn't acquire it. All of these different things show is that there is an element of our life which is beyond us. But now the question comes, is that in relation to death, what is that line where we draw that we say within this line, it's in our control, and outside of our line, it is not within our control? And you find this is what is alluded to within this ayat. So now the first portion of this ayat, it says, Huwalladhi khalaqakum, that Allah is the one who has created you. And it begins by mentioning this discussion related to the attributes of Allah. And over here, there's an important question that we need to ask. And that question is that are we allowed to use this word khaliq, this word creator, for anyone other than Allah? And this discussion will take us into a discussion about adab and etiquette. What I mean is this, is that when you look in the Quran, there are certain verses of the Quran which outwardly seem to apply that this attribute of being khaliq and creator can be used for other individuals. For example, in Surah Al-Imran, in chapter 3, verse 49, there is a quotation in the Quran from the Prophet Jesus. And within that quotation, Prophet Isa, he says, فَأَنِّي أَخْلُقُ لَكُمْ مِنَ الطِّينِ كَهَيَّةِ الطَّيْرِ فَأَنْفُقُ فِيهِ فَيَكُونُ طَيْرًا بِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ. The word he uses is that he says that out of clay, I am going to create the form of a bird. He uses the word akhluqu, which is related to the word khaliq and creating. And he says, when I breathe into this bird will become real by the permission of Allah. So this ayat, it seems to apply that the word khaliq can go towards the Prophet Isa. Another example from the Quran is Surah Al-Mu'minun. In Surah Al-Mu'minun, in the 23rd chapter of the Quran, the 14th ayat of this verse, Allah, he says, فَتَبَارَكَ اللَّهُ أَحْسَنُ الْخَالِقِينَ, that free from defects is Allah, the best of creators. And the word khaliqeen is being used in the plural creators. This would seem to apply that there are other creators besides Allah. Now I come back to the question. The question was, can this attribute of khaliq and creator be applied to anyone other than Allah? You find that oftentimes there are certain verbs and words, even though the quality of that can be applied to the creation, out of adab and etiquette, we don't use it for the creation, we reserve it for Allah. And on the flip side, there are oftentimes qualities of Allah that even though they are mentioned, we don't use them for Allah out of etiquette. For example, Surah Al-Imran, chapter 3, verse 54, it says, وَمَكَرُوا وَمَكَرَ اللَّهُ وَاللَّهُ خَيْرُ الْمَاكِرِينَ, that they plot and Allah plots and Allah is the best of plotters. Have you ever heard a dua when we call Allah, we say, Ya Makir, oh, the one who plots? No, because there is an element of adab and etiquette. And what is that element? That element is this, is that when we call Allah in the way that Allah has taught us to call Him. You know, oftentimes people, they ask this question, is that why does the Quran use the word masculine for Allah? قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. Say that this is Allah, another cannot be imagined for Him. First of all, when the Quran is using the masculine form, in the Arabic language, it does not mean masculine in the sense of gender. That it is a usage which is a metaphorical usage. But the second reason that we reply is that the reason we use the masculine form of the word for Allah is because Allah Himself used this word for His own self. So that is why we're using it out of the realm of adab. And in the same way that there is adab when you address Allah, there is also adab and etiquette when you come to the door of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. You see, when you look at each of these different ziyarat, the beauty of these different ziyarat and this visitation literature is that we are not listening to the virtues of Ahlul Bayt from the tongue of any speaker or poet or orator, but rather we are listening to the virtues of Ahlul Bayt in this ziyarat from the tongue of Ahlul Bayt. These are those ziyarat that come from Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq alayhimus salam. And there is none who knows Imam al-Hussein like the children of Imam al-Hussein. That is why when you go to the ziyarat literature, you understand that Karbala which was presented by Imam al-Baqir and Imam al-Sadiq. You don't get that Karbala which is the imagination of any khatib or orator. This is why you find that these ziyarat are the peak of ishq and love. And what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that Ahlul Bayt is saying that we understand you are our lovers. We understand that you have made this journey for our ziyarat. But the peak of love is that you understand us not through your own thoughts, but you understand us in the way that we've taught you for us to be understood. And you don't address us any way that you want, but you address us in the manner that we've taught you for us to be addressed. This is why Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, he says to Mufaddal, that Ya Mufaddal, ida atayta qabr al-Hussein faquf bil-bab wa qul hadih al-kalimat. That, O Mufaddal, that when you go to the grave of Sayyid al-Shuhada, stop at the grave of Imam al-Hussein and use these words, O Mufaddal. فَإِنَّ لَكَ بِكُلِّ كَلِمَاتٍ كِفْلًا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ. And if you recite this ziyarat that I am giving you word for word, every word that you recite will contain a portion of the mercy of Allah. So you find that this is that etiquette which Ahlul Bayt have given. And in the way there is etiquette for Ahlul Bayt, there is etiquette for Allah obviously at the higher level. And one of that etiquette is that this word khaliq as a sifat, even though as a action it applies to other individuals as the Quran is saying, but as an attribute used to describe someone, we reserve that attribute for Allah. So this is the first element of this ayat. It says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُمْ. Over here, this ayat, which is discussing death, this is still a predestinationalist element that we cannot control whether Allah creates us or not. But then after that, it says something interesting. It says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُمْ مِنْ طِينٍ. That we have created mankind from teen, from clay. You know, clay is a mixture of dirt and water. It is a mixture of turab and ma. The question is that did God create everyone from this same material, or is there a different material which impacts how we approach things? In other words, I'll simplify the question. The question is this, is everyone born with the same likes and dislikes? The same inclinations and disinclinations? Or does everybody have a different mizaj, a different inner constitution? You see, one way to approach this is that when you look at the Quran, if the Quran is saying that mankind is created from clay, and clay is dirt and water, we have to see, does the Quran say that all water is of the same type? Or does the Quran say that there can be different types of water? And over here in Surah Al-Fatir, chapter 35, verse 12, Allah alludes that that water can be of different types. He says, هَذَا عَذْبٌ فُرَاتٌ سَائِغٌ شَرَابُهُ وَهَذَا مِلْحٌ أُجَاجٌ. That there's one type of water which is sweet, which is agreeable, which when a person drinks it, they enjoy that water. But then there is another type of water which is salty. So this is in pertainance to water. Now the second question is that if we said that clay is water and dirt, is all types of dirt the same according to the Quran, or does it differ? Even over here we find the type of land, it differs. The Quran in Surah Al-A'raf, in chapter 7, verse 58, it says, وَالْبَلَدُ الطَّيِّبُ, that as for the pure land, يَخْرُجُ نَبَاتُهُ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِ. The pure land, you find that plants come out of it by the permission of Allah. وَالَّذِي خَبُطَ لَا يَخْرُجُ إِلَّا نَكِدًا. As for that land which is sparse, as for that land which does not have nutrients, you find things come out of it very slowly. You know, in relation to this ayat, there is a famous incident of Imam al-Hasan salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi and Muawiyah, that one day Muawiyah was known for keeping a very light beard. And the tradition of Imam al-Hasan is that he would keep a heavier beard. So you find that Muawiyah says to Imam al-Hasan that prove why yours is better than mine. The Ahlul Bayt are those who know the inner reality of the verses. The Imam al-Hasan replies to Muawiyah by saying that, "Oh Muawiyah, have you not read the verse of the Quran that says that as for the pure land, things come out of it in a fertile manner? And for that land which is desolate, which doesn't have anything in it, things come out of it sparsely." In other words, Imam al-Hasan is alluding to the fact that, oh Muawiyah, you are from that spoiled tree that no fruits they come out of that tree. But we Ahlul Bayt are that pure land that no matter which one of us you go, there is blessings upon blessings that comes from our doorstep. So you find this is that reality. So these verses of the Quran, they point to that in the way water is different, land is different. And if water and land is different, then that clay which is used to create mankind must be different. That's why when you look at Ahlul Bayt and the companions of Ahlul Bayt, many of them had different inclinations. For example, Abu Dhar al-Ghafari wasn't given a position of leadership. But what Abu Dhar al-Ghafari would do is that he would go in front of the Umayyad palaces and he would stand there and he would go towards those palaces in the time of Uthman and he would say that those individuals who hoard the gold and the silver. In other words, he would use that emotional character that he had to make the truth be known. But then you look at another side, you look at Salman al-Muhammadi. Salman, he was the governor of Madain under the second caliph. So even though both of these individuals are the companions of Rasulullah, you find that their inner nature was different in many manners. And this is a profound insight into the human being, that if you see another individual serving Ahlul Bayt in a different manner, don't look down on that individual. Perhaps for him that is the best path. But for you, it may not be the best path. You know, even another example is that one day a man from Syria, he comes to Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. When he comes to Imam as-Sadiq, he says to Imam as-Sadiq that, "O grandson of the Prophet, there are certain questions that I have, and I want to debate and discuss with you. The Imam said that if you are able to discuss and defeat my companions in a debate, then you can come to me. The man says very well. The Imam says, what is your question over? He says, I have some questions about the voweling within the Quran. Some questions pertaining to this aspect. The Imam says very well, then if you want to discuss, go to Humran ibn Ayun. Humran answers the questions. Now he says that I want to discuss about Arabic grammar. Imam Sadiq doesn't say go to Humran again. He says if you want to discuss Arabic grammar, he says go towards whom? He says go to Aban ibn Taghlib. Aban answers the questions. Then after that he comes to the Imam, he says, O grandson of the Prophet, I want to discuss about fiqh. The Imam says go to Zurara ibn Ayun. The man, he comes back, he says that I want to discuss about akhlaq. He says, go to Hamza at-Tayyar. He says, I want to discuss about theology. The Imam says, go to Mu'min at-Taq. He says, I want to discuss about Tawheed. He says, go to Hisham ibn Salim. I want to discuss about Wilayah. The Imam says, go to Hisham ibn al-Hakam. What lesson is the Imam giving? The lesson the Imam is giving is that each of these companions had a different nature and constitution. And based upon that nature, there were certain subjects they were experts in, and there were certain things they did not have knowledge of. And when they were an expert in a subject, only then did the Imam give them permission to discuss. If they were not an expert in the subject, the Imam didn't give them ijazah. In other words, on one level, he is showing that even though all of them are great in front of my eyes, they are different, number one. But number two, all of them stay within their lane. They don't go outside of their area of expertise. So you find the verse says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن طِينٍ, that mankind has been created from clay. And this clay, it differs. But then after that it says, ثُمَّ قَضَى أَجَلًا وَأَجَلٌ مُسَمَّى إِنْدَهُ. But listen to the translation of this verse. The translation, it says, after that, Allah decreed an endpoint, a time of death for you. But then there is another time of death which is known with Allah only. In other words, this ayat is pointing that, O mankind, there are two times of death in your life. And what is the difference between these two times of death? You see, the word ajal is one of the names for death in the Quran. Literally, the word ajal means for a time of a contract to come to an end. That's why in Surah Al-Qasas, in chapter 28, verse 28 and 29, Nabi Musa, when he meets the Prophet Shu'aib, the Prophet Shu'aib said that, O Musa, you can marry my daughter. But it's never that simple. The condition is that either you work for me for 8 years or 10 years. Musa replies to Prophet Shu'aib by saying that, he says, قَالَ ذَلِكَ بَيْنِي وَبَيْنَكَ. Okay, very well. This is between me and you. أَيَّ الْأَجَلَيْنِ, whichever of these two times that I complete, whether it is 8 years or 10 years, أَيَّمَا الْأَجَلَيْنِ قَدَيْتُ فَلَا أُدْوَانَ عَلَيَّ, then there is no blame upon me. And then the next ayah, chapter 2, verse 29, it says, فَلَمَّا قَضَى مُوسَى الْأَجَلَ. So the word ajal means for a time period to end. But in the Quran, the word ajal is being used over here for the death of man. That's why the Quran in Surah Al-Ankabut, in chapter 29, verse 5, it says, مَنْ كَانَ يَرْجُو لِقَاءَ اللَّهِ فَإِنَّ أَجَلَ اللَّهِ لَآتٍ. That whoever desires to meet their Lord, then that end point, that end time with Allah is coming towards them. The basic summary of this ayat is this, is that number one, there is a time of death which is known with God and it is fixed. Anything with Allah, it doesn't change. The Quran says, Ma indakum yanfud. Ma indakum yanfad. That which is with you, it changes, it exhausts, it runs out. Wama indallahi baqin. But that which is with Allah, it remains, it is constant. So there is one time of death for each and every one of us, which is in the knowledge of God, it doesn't change. But then there is a second death that based upon our actions, it brings our death closer to you. That time of death in the knowledge of God, with God, is the farthest one. If we live a life of virtue, then we'll attain that longer period of life. But if we live a life which is not a virtue, then that death will be decreed for us at the closer level. You see, some may turn around and they may ask, is that why does Allah in this ayat mention 2 periods of life for man? Wouldn't it just be more simple to say there is one? You see, the Quran alludes that there was a group of individuals, they believed that when God had made his decree come upon the earth, he couldn't change his decree. And that change is at the level of the earth, because the essence of God, it doesn't change. So for example, the Jews, when they looked at their conditions in Medina, that Islam is on the rise, we're on the downfall, they said that, God decreed this, and now we can't do anything. There's nothing we can do, so we might as well just keep causing problems. The Quran in Surah Al-Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 64, it replies to them. It says, وَقَالَتِ الْيَهُودُ يَدُ اللَّهِ مَغْلُولَةٌ. That the Jews, they say that the hands of Allah are tied. غُلَّتْ أَيْدِيهِمْ. But rather, it is not their hands that are tied, but your hands are tied. وَلُعِنُوا بِمَا قَالُوا. And la'nat is being sent upon them for what they used to say. بَلْ يَدَاهُ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ. But the hands of Allah are open. يُنْفِقُ كَيْفَ يَشَاءُ. And he gives however he wants. In other words, what this ayat is alluding to, and what the philosophy of 2 times of death is this, is that, O mankind, this world is not complete predestination. There is an element which is known as dua. In many of our duas, we see a dua that, oh Allah, extend our life. We never have any dua which says shorten our life, except for that supplication of Imam Zainul Abidin, which says that if my life becomes a pasture for shaitan, under that condition, take it from me, which is found in Dua Makarimul Akhlaq. But aside from that, every dua, it says that, oh Allah, give me more life. So the question that comes in is that if we understand that based upon our actions, our life can be shortened, and if we live a life of virtue, we can achieve the longer time which has been prescribed for us, then what do the narrations mention are those entities which extend our life? The first thing that the hadith they mention is that silatul rahim, maintaining ties with your family members, extends the life of an individual. That an individual who recognizes that God's bounty towards me is my family, and I am maintaining my ties towards them, Allah extends that life. But the moment they break those ties, Allah shortens the life of that individual. Another thing which the narrations they mention that extends the life of an individual is giving sadaqah. Oftentimes, when Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, when Imam as-Sadiq would give sadaqah, Imam as-Sadiq would kiss his hands after giving sadaqah. Oftentimes our parents or our grandparents, they would either kiss the money or they would kiss their hands when they would take sadaqah out. You find not everything is just fables of the old world. Many of these things have a basis in the traditions. They said to the Imam, "O Imam, that why are you kissing your hand?" The Imam says it is because Allah says in the Quran that He accepts the sadaqah of those who give it in His way. In other words, when I give this sadaqah towards this poor individual, it is as if I am doing the ziyarah of Allah. And that metaphoric ziyarah is why I'm kissing my hand. So you find this is another element. But throughout all of this discussion, one element that this ayat is referring to, at the end it says, "Thumma antum tamsarun," that you individuals remain in doubt. In other words, if we are going to place ourselves in this world of free will and predestination, one element, that one stage that we need to reach, one spiritual stage, is that we are okay with the decree of Allah as long as our effort was there. Because many of the problems in Islamic history is because people didn't recognize that there is an element which is in the decree of Allah. For example, this was in relation to even the status of Ahlul Bayt. You know, even if you and I, we read 1,000 units of prayer a night, we will never become Ali ibn Abi Talib. Because that status of Ali is something which is given by God. And Amir al-Mu'mineen refers to this in Nahjul Balagha. The Imam says, our uncle Hamza was not the only person who was killed on the day of Uhud. But when our uncle Hamza was killed, he became Sayyid al-Shuhada. Others didn't become Sayyid al-Shuhada. And my brother Ja'far was not the only one who was killed. But when my brother Ja'far was killed, he was called At-Tayyar, and the one who was given wings. You see, many of these individuals who were around Ahlul Bayt, many of these companions, they could not accept that the decree of Allah was at the door and the wilayah of Ahlul Bayt. You know, Allam al-Hilli, in his famous book Minhajul Karama, he quotes a narration from a Sunni Shafi'i jurist by the name of Ibn al-Maghazali. Ibn al-Maghazali, this individual, he says that one day Rasulullah was in the mosque of the Prophet, and Rasulullah said something strange. Rasulullah, he said that you see the star, the shooting star over here. He said wherever this star it lands, whoever's house it lands at, that individual will be my successor. You see, this story is not an oratory. Allam al-Hilli is quoting it from a very famous Shafi'i jurist. So you find that everyone they gather, they want to look that where is the star going to stop. And it ends up stopping, this fraction, whatever it was, it ends up falling at the door of Ali ibn Abi Talib. And at that moment, Rasulullah says that Ali is my successor, my Khalifa, my Wazir, my representative. At that moment, those companions, they began to say that Rasulullah has made a mistake. That Rasulullah has gone too far in his love of Ali ibn Abi Talib. The moment they said that, Allam al-Hilli, he states that the ayat, the verses of the Quran were revealed, وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى وَلَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. That by the star and when it sets, your companion has not erred, nor has he made a mistake. If he is to speak, he only speaks out of the revelation of Allah. So if Rasulullah is raising the hand of Ali bin Abi Talib on the day of Ghadir, then it is not just a friend and a friend, but it is the Prophet of Allah under the command of Allah raising the hand of Ali. And if Imam al-Hussein comes on the back of Rasulullah, and Rasulullah extends that sajda for Sayyid al-Shuhada, then it's not just a grandfather showing love to his grandson, but rather it is the Prophet of Allah under the command of Allah extending that sajda for Sayyid al-Shuhada. You see, this is that Hussein, that he was so beloved in the eyes of God that Allah says, Inna Allah yuhibbu man ahabba Husayna. That Allah loves the one who loves Hussein. And amongst those individuals who loved Sayyid al-Shuhada, but that love, it became manifested at a later portion of that journey, was the companion of the Imam by the name of Hur. You see, Hur is that individual that each of us relates with the incident of Hur. Because we find ourselves in this inner struggle between right and wrong. And we find ourselves that in the way Hur had choice and decisions, we have choices and decisions. That at the end of the day, no matter what sin we did, our mistake wasn't as big as the mistake of Hur. That Hur is the one who stopped the army of Imam al-Hussein. You know, it's stated that before the army of Imam al-Hussein encounters the army of Hur, Imam al-Hussein commanded his companions that at this halting station, take extra water with you. The companions, they said, we didn't know why Hussein wanted extra water to be taken. When they see that there is an army that is coming, you find that those individuals in the army of Hur were thirsty. Those same individuals who would deny Sayyid al-Shuhada water. Imam al-Hussein, he tells his companions that go and give them water. One man, it's mentioned in Tariq al-Tabari, one man, he says that I had become so weak in this journey that I couldn't pick up the water bag and put it upon my mouth. And as I was struggling, I saw that a man, he came to me. And when he came to me, he said, Anzil al-Raviya, that make your camel come down. He says that he was speaking in the lahja of Quraysh, so I couldn't understand it. So then he said, Anzil al-Naqa, that make the camel come down in our own lahja. Then I understood him. So when my camel, it came down, this individual, he takes the water bag with his hand, he places it upon my mouth, and I drank from the water. Later on, when I would go away, I would say to the people that who was that man? They would say that that is Hussein ibn Ali. The same individuals who would leave the children of Sayyid al-Shuhada thirsty in front of him. Imam al-Hussein, he gives them water. Imam, he encounters Hur in that army. Hur says that I have been commanded to make you stop. The Imam says, Taqilatka ummuk, that may your mother weep over you. That in other words, that do you not realize what you are doing? At that moment, Hur, he showed that his heart still had some ma'rifat. Because Hur, he replies by saying that if your mother was anyone other than Fatima Zahra, then I would say the same line towards you. You see, the day of Ashura, it approached. And as Shab-e Ashur it came, Hur, he would notice one side on the side of Imam al-Hussein. And then he would look to the side of Umar ibn Saad. One individual says to Hur, O Hur, that if somebody asks me that who was the most firm man in this army, we would say that you are that individual, that when you make a decision, you don't hesitate anywhere. Why do you look as if you are in a state of worry tonight? Hur, he replies by saying that on this night, I find myself in between heaven and hell. From one side, I hear the cries of Al-Atash, Al-Atash, the thirst from the side of Sayyid al-Shuhada. Then on the other side, I see the army of Shimar and Umar ibn Saad. It stated as Hur was deciding, Hur with his servant, with his son, he begins to go to the side of Imam al-Hussein. And as he's going to the side of Imam al-Hussein, Hur, he says to his servant that, oh my servant, tie my arms, because these are those arms that stopped Sayyid al-Shuhada. He goes to Imam al-Hussein and he looks at the Imam and he says, Halli tawbah, that, oh my master, is there any forgiveness for me? Imam al-Hussein, he says, O Hur, not only have I forgiven you, but Allah has forgiven you, O Hur. Some maqatil, they say, the Imam, he replies, he says, O Hur, but this is that moment where I ask you to forgive me, O Hur. I say, O Sayyid al-Shuhada, what did you do that you were asking for forgiveness? Imam al-Hussein, he says, O Hur, you have come as my guest right now. I don't even have water to offer you, O Hur. Hur, he comes to the side of the Imam. It is stated that in some narrations, the son of Hur was the first individual to go from the companions. When the son of Hur, he goes to the battlefield, he begins to fight. And as he's fighting, a moment it comes, he calls on his father. He says, "Oh father, ya abata, I ask help at this moment. I send my salam towards you." You know what occurs? Hur, he goes to the body of his son. But when he goes to the body of his son, he sees that the head of his son is in the lap of Imam al-Hussein. Hur says, "Oh my master, why have you come? You should have stayed back." Imam al-Hussein says, "Oh Hur, a father shouldn't have to see the body of his young son, oh Hur. But I say, oh Imam, a time will come on the day of Ashura when Ali Akbar will say, Ya Abata alayka minni salam, that, oh father, take my salam, that you'll go to the body of Ali Akbar. No one will be with you at that moment, and you'll place your cheek on the cheek of Ali Akbar. فَوَضَعَ خَدَّ الْحُسَيْنِ فَوَضَعَ الْحُسَيْنِ خَدَّهُ عَلَى خَدِّ Ali Akbar. That the Imam will place his cheek on the cheek of Ali Akbar, and he'll say, "Ala dunya ba'daka al-afaya Ali Akbar." That, oh Ali Akbar, may this world become dust after you, oh Ali Akbar. But right now, Imam al-Hussein is by the body of the son of Hur. You see, after that, Hur, he begins to go to the battlefield. And as Hur is fighting, a point it comes, فَقَتَلُوهُ إِرْبًا إِرْبًا. From all sides, they surround Hur. That moment it comes that Hur, he falls towards the ground. Hur, he says, "Oh my master, did I fulfill my loyalty towards you?" The Imam says, "Oh Hur, you fulfilled that promise. Ala la'natullah ala al-qawm al-zalimin." Ya Allah, we ask through the right of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad that you allow us to come like Hur towards the doorstep of Ahlul Bayt. Ya Allah, we pray that you forgive our sins, that you elevate our marhumeen, that you grant us the tawfiq to stay upon the path of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, that you grant us the shafa'ah in the intercession of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, that you grant us the ziyarah of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, and you allow us to see the hastening of the reappearance of the 12th of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, Matam Hussein.